Today's program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Kim Lim, The Space Between. It is the largest retrospective ever of Singapore-born British sculptor and printmaker Kim Lim. It is an amazing show, and I say that not only because I work here, but because it allows us to trace the evolution of her practice over 4 decades, and it's just beautifully and sympathetically put together. So please go see it again. This panel is called Leaving to Thrive because Singapore artists have for decades been going abroad to advance their practice, and very often to the United Kingdom for art education. Kim Lim is, of course, one of the most prominent examples. In 1954, she left for London to study at the St. Martin's School of Fine Art, and then later the Slade School of Fine Art. And while at times overlooked, she achieved a degree of success in her time and had solo exhibitions and participated in survey shows of British and Singapore art. There was also struggle, as you may read in the words of the artists, her sons, Alex and Johnny Turnbull. A bit of promotion for the gallery's publications. Grab it at the museum shop, or you can browse it afterwards over here. It wasn't easy by any means for Kim Lim, alongside her husband, the Scottish artist William Turnbull, to make a life and career in the UK. And yet, it was being there, in the context of with arts, options for art schools, immersion in that post-war avant-garde context, as well as places to exhibit her work, that also allowed her to thrive as an artist. So today's panel's intention is not to dwell on Kim Lim's biography, but instead to kind of obliquely engage with what it meant for this Singapore girl. She was only 17 when she left, to have uprooted herself in this kind of desire to do art, to learn about art. So we want to think how different or similar things are now. Today it's maybe so common for contemporary artists to spend long periods away, preparing for biennials, international commissions, residencies, touring performances, or maybe like Kim Lim often did, they can simply buy a plane ticket and travel, seek inspiration. Of course, leaving nowadays, this means also that leaving nowadays need not be such a grand journey, or hold great psychic or emotional significance. Of course, depending on medium and practice, artists can also work remotely. For example, though this may seem banal in this post-COVID-19 world, this wasn't and isn't always the case. So what else? Maybe Singapore artists don't choose the UK anymore. Maybe opportunities abound globally, and maybe we have perhaps shaken off some of our post-colonial attachments. Or maybe their practices and affinities lead them along different paths, And then there's family. How are familial ties broken, maintained, or reaffirmed where artists go? The three artist panelists we have here today are Zee Zunnur, Mintio, and also known as Samantha Teo, and Erika Tan. All were born in Singapore, but left at different times for different reasons to different places. Their trajectories are diverse, but I think you'll see a through line in their presentations, an interest in movement and in kinship. I've given them the impossible task of sharing their respective practices in 15 minutes each, so we'll see how we get on. I will cue you very obviously. After each artist presents, I will ask a short question before the next presentation. And then afterwards, we'll chat a bit more, take questions from the audience at the end. And I also encourage the panelists to jump in with questions, respond to one another as we go along. I hope that sounds okay. And all right, we can start with our first presentation by Zee. Oh, let me introduce you first, yeah. Not to shush you. Zee Zunnur is a Singapore-born movement artist, seated beside me here. She was a long-time dancer with the Hofesh Schechter company, touring internationally as performer and as teacher. As she threads her practice in contemporary realms, she stays connected to her Malay heritage and training in Malay dance. She has performed and choreographed for THE Dance Company, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Ignition Dance Festival, Singapore Biennale, and more. Presently based in Australia, she has worked with the Struts Dance, Co3 Australia, Mitch Harvey Company, WAPA, Fremantle Biennale, and many distinguished choreographers and artists. So Zee is doing a performance response to the Kim Lim exhibition tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. Another shout out. It's called Morphological, and she will be telling us a little bit about it. Okay, thank you. Over to Zee.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Lucas, for the intro. So I'm a dancer choreographer. Most of the time I'm based in Australia, but I'm very, very nomadic with my lifestyle. I pretty much just go wherever, bop around wherever I need to be. I grew up here in Singapore. I trained in classical Malay folk dance. That was pretty much my upbringing. That was my start and my engine to dance. And then SOTA came about. So some of you who are not from Singapore, there's a School of the Arts Singapore here, and I was in the pioneer batch of SOTA. And I auditioned through Malay dance, and that was my first introduction to all sorts of Western art. It was my first introduction to ballet, to contemporary. Pretty much started late as compared to a lot of my other friends in school. And whilst I was in SOTA, I fell in love with choreography, and I just love making movement. And I thought I really want to dig deep in this. And being an 18, 19-year-old, massive teenager, feeling frustrated, and I kind of really wanted a new entry point, a new flavor. And I really wanted to go somewhere outside of the bubble that I'm familiar with. And I was very lucky, and I got the support from the National Arts Council Singapore to pursue my undergraduate BA honours in contemporary dance. And I went to London Contemporary Dance School. And that's where I spent my early years of training in contemporary dance. And whilst I was in London, I had a lot of exposure with the style and methodologies of this amazing current contemporary choreographer called Hoffe Schechter. And he comes from a very strong folk background himself, from his own ethnicity. And I auditioned for his company on the year that I graduated. It was about 1,500 people that came for the audition that year. It's a huge company, and it's quite competitive with auditions in contemporary dance companies sometimes internationally. And I was one of the 8 that he chose. And I was one of the only non-European, non-British person that got into that company. It was a pinch myself moment, right? So I thought, oh, this is possible. I could do it. I could do it. I was the first Singaporean as well to ever be in a company of that level. So I was like, okay, we're here now. So I was with him for about 7 years. We were touring all over the world. It's a touring dance company. We traveled everywhere. We performed everywhere. Now I'm a freelancer, which is why I'm still bopping around and going through different places, mostly based in Australia, in Perth at the moment. Yes. And so I thought maybe before I talk further about what I do and my practice and my work, I thought maybe I should show you a video of a trailer of the work for tomorrow that I'm performing in Kim Lim's exhibition downstairs in response to her work. It's called Morphological. Yeah, just that to give you an essence of the work for tomorrow. So I might talk a little bit more about the work later on. But just to start off with, maybe I'll play this next video. Yeah. All right, cool. I'm just gonna be playing like a video. Maybe we'll have the volume a little bit lower for this one. I'll just have that video at the back whilst I'm chatting and talking about my practice. So basically, Because of my very, very folk background and working with Hofesh sector for a really long time, I have this connection with my hands and my head, my gaze and my feet. How I use these extremities of the body to interact with space. And I find the extremities of the body, they're such a great engine to storytell. Yeah, whenever we talk with our hands like this. Yeah, I don't quite like working with the center of my body, and a lot of the dance styles, you start with the core and you kind of float and move around space like this, but I quite like to maneuver around space using the outsides of my body. And I find that with the extremities of the body, it's kind of like awakening the vessel of my body. So my body is my vessel, and how I move it through space is by starting it with the extremes of my body. Yeah. And so I'm going to go to the next point to talk about morphology, which is basically where the title came from to respond to Kim Lim's work. Can we have the volume a little bit lower, much lower actually? Yeah, thank you. So I practice this thing called morphology, and morphology comes from a biological term, and it can also come from a linguistic term as well. So I come from linguistic parents. My parents are Malay linguists. They teach Malay literature. I grew up with that. Yeah, I come from a really strong language background. So even within my practice, I play a lot with poetry. I play a lot with words. I bring all of this inspiration into the studio. And whenever I work with dancers, that's kind of one of my starting points. Working with the morphemes and the base words of things. So in terms of the linguistic perspective, it's just morphology is looking at the morphemes of words, base of words, and how we can expand and come up with lots of different definitions and how they correlate with one another. I just love that word play games. And in a biological sense, it's also looking at how animals and insects and organisms and creatures, how they move, how they interact. I have a bit of an obsession with exoskeletons, how things can vibrate and rupture. There's this sense of like internal ruptures that happens inside of you, and how movement can be expressed in that way. I'll just play this in the back as well, just for you to have a sense. It's just a dance reel that I've put together of myself in various works that I've been in, some of which I've danced for other people or work of myself. And so just noting it back to Kim Lim's work, she also explores morphology in her practice, looking at insects, the nature, animals, and how their movement interact with one another, even the materials and the materiality that she uses within her work. It's so simple, but there is this sense of, you look at one of her works, there's all these lines that are carved in between all her works, and I just love how I can imagine myself being this creature that morphs through these lines with a lot of tension. I play with a lot of tension within my body and vibrations to maneuver myself through space. And a series of her work that I was very inspired by was called the Padma. So she has four different versions of the Padma. There's Padma 1, 2, 3, and 4. I was very, very inspired by the Padma 1 because as compared to the 2, 3, and 4, it's got a very rounded shape to it. And even in my work, I do bring out this essence of the femininity that I have in my body and me being a female, and I bring that out of myself naturally within my movement as I morph myself through space. And then also what I love about morphology is this idea of how something doesn't stop. The energy just keeps rolling, it circulates, it keeps moving. I can be angular, but the angularity always lives within the morphing world. That is my commitment to morphing is extreme. It's like the warping, the contortion, the extremities, how I can push the circular motion. It can be quite gross and disgusting of how I push myself You know, and I love things that are gross and disgusting and a little bit, not a little bit, very guttural. It's very guttural and very instinctive what I do. And I think this relates very well with who I am as a nomadic person who constantly travels around a lot. I, I think looking back, I've always had to learn how to anchor myself. It doesn't matter where I am geographically, anchor myself down amidst this morphing that happens around my life and being around different spaces, places, people, languages, culture. And it's really like seeking my own culture within all of this. Without me knowing, I think when I first left Singapore, maybe it came from a place of anger and frustration of wanting to get something new for myself. But I think looking back now, it was really about who am I? Who am I within all of these things? I was very aware of the various identities that I was holding as a person. Of course, other than being a woman, being a daughter, being a partner, all these responsibilities that I have, I was very aware of the various ethnicities that I have within my genealogy, within my DNA, all the cultures that I have. How do you make sense of it when there's all these million things that are put onto you? You have to I think space is a very important thing. I think going away gives you that clarity to look back and go, okay, what is it? How can I make sense of it? So I think that essence of me is very much prevalent within my practice, within morphology, how I find the anchor within myself to morph through spaces and places with massive currents that will swirl around constantly. How am I going? Do I have a little bit more time? So I thought now, okay, so this is actually a video I found when I was making a new work on the graduating WAPA students. So WAPA is Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts. They're a arts university based in Perth, Australia. And I found this video and I thought that is how I would love to move. It's very of course, AI generated. None of us can move like that. We know that. And I thought that is morphology. You know, it's like how you can find repetition and loop something that doesn't stop. And it's so continuous. I thought that's it. That's what it's such a good visual image of morphing in general. And this is Rizman Putra. Some of you might be familiar with his name. He is an amazing local Singaporean-based artist, and this is one of his works called Boneka. So in my language, in Malay language, it means dolls, dolls that you play with. And this has always been my first point of reference whenever I start a new process in the studio with my dancers. Because if you have a look at the photo, all these figurines, it can look like organisms, human figurines. It could be anything, right? But there's somehow like a 3D effect that comes forward. You can almost feel it in your hands, the texture of it. It might be scaly or soft or hard, or there is all this feeling already that you feel it in your hands. And I think the richness of this artwork for me really encapsulates what morphology is for me. How you could be this one little thing that can be really independent, but it makes so much sense when you morph and amalgamate it together in a clump, and you can work as an organisms together in space. Yeah. So this is another great reference that I always have in the studio when I'm working with my dancers. And again, I work with various group of dancers. Some of them can come from really technical background, very classical ballet background. It's also understanding how to have different entry points for different type of dances as well. Some people come from, I don't know, like more folk background. And because I come from various entry points myself, it's very, very fascinating and fun to be in space with people of different approaches. There's something else. So these are 5 insects that were chosen by audiences who read The Guardian. Yeah, and they are invertebrates. So insects that are spineless, basically, or lack of spine. And I am obsessed with creatures that basically can morph so well, like that video I showed you earlier on. So we've got the swallowtail butterfly, the barrel jellyfish, minotaur beetle, the glowworm, and the ash black slug, all of which have very, very different qualities to them and how they move. And I bring the essence of the way they function. I study them. I explore them with my dancers. I develop these movements with them through improvisational methods, and then piecing things together in space. That's it's very exciting for me because you just see weird creatures literally in front of you doing all this movement stuff, and it's very, very exciting. I play a lot with sensations. It has to be real. So for instance, if I really want them to feel like they're pushing something really hard in front of them, you just ask them to go to the wall and push the wall. And then we bring that in space and really embody what it feels like to push something in space. Yeah, it's very true, it's very genuine. That's why for me, all the sensations come from a very real internal place. Yeah, we don't put it from outside to in. We go in and we emanate it outwards. So just to wrap up kind of the feeling or the world that I like to live in as a dancer, as a choreographer, when I make extremities of the body that conjures story. I love to play with storytelling. I work with an indigenous contemporary dance company based in Australia called Marageku. I do a lot of work with them, and they're all about storytelling. And for me, storytelling, you know, when you see somebody with wisdom and lots of stories in their body, they have a lot of power in their hands. And I think there is so much power in the way they articulate the extremities of the body, how they use their gaze in space, how they open up the space with their eyes and their feet. And it's very internal, it's very animalistic, it's very ritualistic, what I do as well. Very grounded. I hate going on my tippy toes, even though I am trained in classical ballet, hate it. Very rhythmic, very groovy. A lot of the soundscapes that I work with, the composers that I work with. For instance, Safwan Johari, he's my composer for Morphological that I'm performing tomorrow. He is brilliant. He's also a Singaporean local Malay artist. He has a very good sense of the traditional sounds that I have grown up with, but knows how to warp and morph it and understand how I live with my work. I work in a lucid world as well. We archive dreams in our process. Contorted, very weird, very guttural, disgusting, and very passionate. So it was a great challenge from Lucas for me to wrap up my practice in 15 minutes, but here I am. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Zee. No, you did it wonderfully, quite close to the timing. One question. So the last performance you showed us in your reel was Mutiara, right? Which you choreographed and performed with Marageku. So audiences will recall it is the one with the blue sequence, you know, there were these ropes hanging center stage and then there were projections on it. So I was hoping you could say a little bit about that work actually, you know, with the Broome community, the people that you encountered there. Yeah.
So to start off the story, I was stuck in Australia. My partner's Australian. We live in Perth. And this company, Marageku, they are based in Broome. Maybe some of you have heard of Broome. They are based in they are located geographically, they are north of Western Australia, yeah, in the really hot region up there. And they knew that I was stuck in COVID in Perth. And they said, hey, Zee, come up, hang out with us. So I went up there, already feeling very lost because I was like, oh my God, Perth, what the hell? I don't feel at home here yet. Like, I don't understand this place. And the moment I landed my feet in Broome, my jaw dropped. I was like, what is this place? Why do I feel so at home? It's like tropical. You got all the trees that are so familiar, like Singapore. I felt so welcomed. Everybody looked like me. People thought I was from Broome. And then I found out about the history of it. And the reason why Broome community is so very inter-ethnical mixed is because they have this history of the pearl divers. Yeah. So back in the day, all the British people owned the companies of pearls. The pearls back then, you know, during like 1800s, early 1900s, it was one of the biggest economical gain for Australia. You had one of the best pearls in the world, and it came from Broome. So what the British did was hire a lot of Southeast Asian men over to Broome to work as pearl divers. These men had no idea what they were coming to Australia for. They thought, oh, I'm leaving Singapore for a great job. I'm leaving Malaysia. Lots of Chinese men, lots of Malay men, lots of Indonesian, Filipinos. You have lots of Japanese men coming through. Had no idea what they were coming to Australia for. Basically forced into labor. Their passports were taken away. So they could, this was the way the British wanted them to pay back the money that they got them to Australia, basically. And so a lot of these men actually intermarried Indigenous women in Broome, Indigenous Australians in Broome, and made Australia home. There is a beautiful, beautiful man in his 80s. His name is Dato Ahmad. Dato in Malay means granddad. I call him Dato Ahmad. And he's a Singaporean man. He has married an indigenous Broome woman, and he has made Broome home. Every time I come to Broome and to develop this work called Mutiara, Mutiara means pearl, and he would cook me all the Malay food, everything that I would ever have in Singapore. You know, it really feels like I'm in Singapore. You got all the Singaporean community there. And I was like, wow, I never knew about this story. I didn't know my people went to Australia and has made Australia home because of this pearl diving history. So we made a whole story about the dark history of the pearl divers and what happened to all these men, how they die because of diving, how they were forced into labor, the process of diving. We spoke to all these ex-divers who has made Broome home, all these Japanese men, all these Malay men who's lived there now. Wow, my eyes were wide open. And Broome was the only place that was exempted from the white Australian policy. Some of you are familiar with Australian history. There was a long period of time in Australian history where they just wiped out a lot of the indigenous people to make Australia white, basically. And Broome was exempted from that because they needed all these Asian men to come and work as divers, which is why when you go there now, it is one of the most intercultural places you can ever go to in Australia. And if Australia did not have that policy, the whole country would still be like that. Yeah. So we made a whole show on that, and we performed it at the Perth Festival and Sydney Festival at the beginning of 2024 in Australia. So I hope that we can bring it to Singapore, because I think it's such an important story to share, because we had so many of our people, especially back in the 50s and 60s, that went there. And Broome people loved the Singaporean men because they said they are the most stylish people that ever came, and they brought in fashion, and they had so much style, and da, da, da. Yeah, they loved it. They loved the Singaporean men there. They definitely had the time of their life. But yes, that is Mutiara. Thank you, Lucas.
Thanks, Zee. Thank you. So I think maybe next up we'll have Min to come take over.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mintio, and I'm an image-based artist. I'm a landscape artist, starting very much with working with images coming from photography, but I'm really interested in actually extending the image into different material forms, into different spaces, and also playing around with different levels of opacity, translucency, creating kind of intersections as they overlay with the environment and on top with each other. So I'm actually beginning today's
Min, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I know I can't do better than you at introducing, but maybe give me the honor of introducing you properly. Sorry. So, Mintio seamlessly, as you'll see, blends traditional lens-based techniques with avant-garde approaches. She transcends the boundaries of analog photography, and her work often takes the form of large-scale immersive experiences and have been acquired by Google, Singapore Art Museum, and other institutions. She has exhibited internationally, such as at the Woodlands Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, and the Museo San Domenico in Forlì, Italy. She's also an educator and a co-founder of Co-Creation Workshop, a social enterprise that provides creative programs to schools, corporations, and social organizations. She was the founding artistic director of the Ketemu project in Bali, which was when I first met her. And Min will tell us more about how going to Indonesia inflected her life and practice.
So starting with this image comes from a body of work which I'll be showing later on. And for me, when we think about spaces in between, I think about the sea, because the sea is the very body of water that actually separates and joins the spaces that I've been moving between, which is mainly Singapore, Java, and also Bali. And the sea is a meeting point where I feel the water is a very significant part of where everything comes together, whether it's the movement in terms of the currents, and it's also something that I feel significantly in my body and in our bodies as human beings, water being a very, very huge percentage of like that the makeup of our bodies itself. So water is a very big part of a lot of the works that I realized I've created over the past couple of years. Okay, so I'm just going to go through time chronologically. And the first time when I left was in 2010, and the first destination was Yogyakarta. But prior to that, I was studying actually at the NTU School of Art, Design and Media. I was the first batch, and I was also part of the photography department. We have some students actually currently doing their final year here, where I'm also teaching right now. And I still remember being in a hall with TK Sabapati. He's a historian, also a writer, and we really had the privilege of having him as our Asian art history lecturer. And I was just so enthralled and really romanticizing Yogyakarta through his lessons and his lectures. He would be talking about Borobudur, and he would be talking about like the Buddha statues, and he would be talking about Prambanan. And there's a young artist, or upon graduation, I told myself, I'm gonna go to Yogyakarta someday. And lo and behold, right after I graduated, I was like, I'm going straight to Yogyakarta. But prior to that, I also had the privilege of exhibiting in Seoul together with Angki Pubardano, who's part of Mes 56. And I knew as a young artist, I would not be able to get into any residency. So I just kind of like snuck up to Angki and said, hey Angki, give me a residency program. And he was like, okay, Mintio, just come. So there I was like, okay, Angki, I'm coming, okay. And in 2010, okay, so this was before the residency. That was also when I was working together with Valentine Willie Fine Art. He had a couple of galleries around Southeast Asia, and he was at that point in time really the gallery that really connected a lot of Southeast Asian contemporary artists. So through his gallery, there was a kind of roving exhibition that you can see at the top right-hand corner over there of photography works, and that was really the starting point as well, where contemporary photography was really kind of starting to be looked into as fine art. And it was a perfect time because I was a fine art graduate with photography as the main discipline. So it was perfect timing. So at that point in time, we had Eva McGovern as the curator, and there was a traveling roving show, which ended last in Yogyakarta. So that was the first time I went to Yogyakarta and absolutely fell in love with that beautiful, beautiful town, city. Also the very beautiful spiritual space where I actually have this banyan tree that you see over here, which was the banyan tree that was outside of Tembi Contemporary, also a gallery that belonged to Valentine. And that was where I really felt like, okay, this is the space I'm going to be in for some time. So in 2011, I left Singapore for Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and I was invited to join a residency program with Mes 56. And I was really taken away by the rich material culture, the layers of cultural history, the space and time, which we barely have in Singapore, that I will gain when I will go to Yogyakarta. So with that space and time, time moving in Java, in Yogyakarta, in a very, very slow and rhythmic way. I spent two years in Yogyakarta, and this was part of my research and production of my residency at Mes Limanam. It's called Malam di Jari Kita. Malam here is a pun because malam in Malay or in Indonesian means the night. And it also means the wax that artisans that create batik used to create some of the batik pieces here. So the batik that I'm wearing here is actually created by the malam from true chanting, which is the pen that creates beautiful motifs and images onto the fabric. So malam both means wax and as well night. So I thought, hey, you know, this is a wordplay, the night on our fingers as well. And it was also the first time I started to name and title my works through the Indonesian language. So it's a merger of photography and batik, and it's about creating these unique self-portraits where batik makers kind of re-own their silhouette and their images through cyanotype print and as well as the medium that they mainly work with. And we're here talking about personal identity and exploring women's relationship through their craft, family, and society, highlighting how these familiar techniques can lead to new creative expression. So one thing that really struck me when I was in Yogyakarta is that the art world was really pretty much a man's world back then in 2010. Okay, maybe things have changed, but I was really questioning my identity and my role as a female artist, and I was also wondering, hey, so you know, where do women stand as cultural producers? And that's where I decided, you know, it's time to really look back into the cultural history and also go into this, like all these nooks and crannies of like villages that's actually surrounding the two karatons of Solo and Yogyakarta. And there I was in Kebon Indah meeting these beautiful ladies. And every time when I meet them and I greet them and I shake their hands, you just feel this warmth and stickiness. And that's how the title, The Wax on Our Fingers, actually come about, from that sensation of greeting and saying hello and meeting, and then eventually getting to know their families and also their lives. So this is a whole family of 3 generations of batik makers, and they all sleep in the main area in the living room together. So was how we actually came about the idea of creating this 4-panel piece where they will be under the blanket together. But the blanket itself is actually a very significant solo royal pattern that talks a lot about the universal and the spiritual elements of the Javanese belief, which is kejawen, which is the old Javanese belief, being combined with the new Islam or like Muslim ideas as well. I also wanted to kind of unveil and reveal the process of batik making, and that's why this piece is actually in graphite pencil, also reflecting the stage of batik producing that these women do, which is actually the sketching, which, you know, I just really do not want to miss out like the very, very soft and delicate process of actually going through the dyeing process and even the waxing. Because every time we think about batik, we think about the wax. But prior to that, there's also the carbon, the pencil, and also the drawings where all these artisans actually transfer motifs onto as well. So this was an exhibition that was in Yogyakarta. It was in Tita Ruby's space, and formerly, historically, this space was also a batik storage space. So we kind of like spruced it up and created this beautiful, wonderful exhibition opening. There was no guest of honor. There was just the women coming. We had this like we chartered a bus from Kebon Indah all the way to Yogyakarta, which is about like a 3-hour drive. Those with bus sickness didn't quite make it, but they all like kind of hung on. And there they were with their families, with their husbands, with their children. It's like, oh, that is me. And they're like so excited. And even like one of the elderly members of the group over here, she was just standing in front of her artwork like a true blue artist, really just kind of sharing about the process and the artwork. So it was really, really a wonderful memory. So this artwork was created in collaboration with my longtime artistic partner, Budi Agung Kuswara, whom I also met in Yogyakarta. And we, from this artwork had a extended partnership of about 10 years, where we regularly created art with one another. So the energy in Indonesia that I felt was really different from Singapore. It was raw, it was vibrant, and to me as a young artist, it was full of potential. My time in Yogyakarta really changed the way I approach my practice. I think for some of you who know my work prior to that, it was a lot more on working with the urban landscape. So this really led me to explore more of community engaged methods for producing work. So 2014, that's where I got married. I got married in 2012, and that's where I actually moved to Bali to start a family. So you can actually see me and my baby, my firstborn over here, in a ritual where we celebrated her 3 months of birth. And that was where I actually kind of really directly reckoned with the tradition and roots of my husband, which was the Balinese Hindu practice, and that became like a layer on top of my life as well as I moved to Bali. But starting a family for me was not just starting my own kind of blood family, but it was also starting a family in terms of starting a new organization, which was Ketemu Project, and also starting off artistic residencies based in Bali. So it really made a significant shift in my practice. I collaborated with local communities, created site-specific works where, as Singapore, in our landscape, it's actually really difficult. And I also start to explore themes that I really previously did not touch on. Being in Indonesia, however, although with all the excitement, I had moments of struggle as well. I was an outsider. I was new to the culture. I was also navigating a really different art scene. So in those moments, I did see myself grow and expand in very, very interesting ways that I never expected. So with this artwork, Arus Belabu Kita, we come back to the sea again. Arus means the currents or tides. Belabu is to port. So there's this very romantic saying, if you meet your soulmate, you say, hati saya belabu di hatimu, like I've found my love or my heart has found port or has found its port in your heart or in your space. So belabu had this very romantic sway to it. And then kita just means we. And kita is a word that I really love in the Indonesian language because it suggests this form of like collectiveness, kita. Kita, we're here right now. So for this, I really wanted to work with local materials, Indonesian materials, which interestingly, I worked with banana bark fiber, which was actually very strongly, deeply researched by a Japanese artisan or researcher or a paper maker, Mr. Narose Kiyoshi, who actually migrated and left Japan. He was a publisher in Japan, and he migrated and left Japan to be in Bali to actually really extensively research on paper making from the banana bark. And I thought that was such a wonderful material to play with, to embark on. And I was actually really curious, together with Budi Kabu, as to how the photographic image could be embedded into the materiality of all these organic material that Indonesia that's so rich of. So this installation draws thematically on migrational memories because I essentially migrated from Singapore to Indonesia. And it's also about the shared waterways that we have between the two countries. I was reflecting a lot on my own experience navigating between Singapore and Indonesia. And so this installation actually kind of imagined children captaining a voyage across time and space, symbolizing a kind of exchange of ideas and cultural histories that shape both the past and future. And this exhibition was aptly actually showcased at the Asian Civilization Museum, which collection also showed a lot about the port histories of Singapore, about all these intercultural transformation, amalgamation of ideas and materials. And uniquely, the space is also opposite, the direct symmetrical opposite of the Belitung shipwreck, which was also found in the waters of Indonesia, that eventually had found home, or its final resting place, as I would say, at the Asian civilization in Singapore, right here. At that point in time, there was also a very dark part of our kind of world history that was unfolding. There was also a lot of migrational crisis happening around the world. There will be refugees moving around, trying to find ports in new places. Singapore was one of them. Indonesia was one of them. And I remember very distinctly on the news, there was this image of a child face down on the beach, and he was just like pale, he's all white. He was wearing a life jacket and he was lifeless. And that struck me that, you know, children are not spared from the conflicts of the adults, the conflicts of drawing lines between who they are, who we are, drawing lines between geography. So I wanted the work to kind of redeem this very dark part of whatever that was happening globally around the world, to say, hey, the children are not victims of the conflict. They are captains of it. And that's why I want to reimagine when creating this work. They know where they're heading. They have like full like captainship of like what they're doing, and they really live and draw life from the sea. So, and that was also when my daughter was about 5 years old, thereabouts, and that was where we were also celebrating her multiple identities of being both Balinese, Indonesian, and also Chinese Singaporean. So in 2017, I found myself in a liminal state between both Bali and Singapore. At that point in time, I was invited by Sabrina to start teaching at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Art. I very fondly put a picture of my NAFA students over there at the corner. I had a great time, a wonderful time teaching them. That was also the time where I started actually becoming an educational facilitator here at the National Gallery. So that's me, with a group of girls who also happened to be my primary school, Raffles Girls Primary School. So I met them in the gallery. I was like, I'm so excited to show them the works of the National Gallery. And there was also the period of time where I actually came back to spend more time with my mom and dad. And I think a couple of years have less already. And that was when I was like, oh, you know, they have really aged. And that's where it was really kind of like juggling, making ends meet, being an educator, trying to maintain my practice, and also trying to hold fort as a parent at the same time as a mother. All right. So during this time, I shuttled between Bali and Singapore. I took on the role of an educator at NAFA as well as the National Gallery. Engaging with young artists really deeply rejuvenated me and my practice, because I feel that they offer rich and fresh perspectives and creative energy. But my move into teaching was also born out of necessity to really make ends meet. And that also added a layer of, like, frankly, stress. But I would say complexity to the experience. So in this time where I was in this liminal state, I created this artwork also together with Budi, titled Penghibur Hati Lara. This came as a lyric and a line from one of the old films, the Malay seminal films that I was responding to as part of the State of Motion, which was actually organized by the Asian Film Archives at that time. So as they approached me, they was like, I want you, the curator, Camelia Bada, told me the prompt was to actually respond to the film Dara Muda. And in Dara Muda, there was this female protagonist who was separated from her child. And prior to that separation, she sung a beautiful lullaby that talked about how being her child was part solace to the heart, hence the title Penghibur Hati Lara. And in that beautiful song, I wanted to recreate moments of reunion between parent and child who have been separated for an extended period of time. And all these parents are, as you know, the title of the panel titles it, they left to thrive. They left to find a way to sustain the family. But yet at the same time, they do have to also grapple with the guilt, the anxiety of being far away from their child. And as I watched the film, Dara Muda, I really empathized and felt like I was in the same shoes of the protagonist, being separated my child out of economic necessity to become an educator right here. So this site-specific work was actually shown in this beautiful forest between the Changi Women's Prison as well as Changi Airport. And that particular line was also the same line where land reclamation took place for the Changi Airport. And in the film, Dara Muda itself, there was also the beach or the shoreline where the protagonist would secretly find ways to reunite with her baby and her child. So the nanny would push the child for beach walks, and that's where she would secretly creep out to the stroller and say, "Oh, what's this child's name?" Pretending not to be in kinship or in blood relationship with the child. And then she will kind of like try to say, "Hey, is it okay if I carry the child for a bit?" And that moment of secrecy, that moment of reunion was something that I really want to capture in this site, in this forest, that was long forgotten as the shoreline, one of the shorelines of Singapore. As we begin our progress, our rapid land reclamation, all in that rat race to really expand our shorelines and our borders, and also the land space that we have in Singapore. So with my artwork, I really enjoy, or I'm really drawn to work with skill. A lot of times, the skill of the humans, the skill of the portraitures, they're beyond actual skill itself. And the reason is because as the viewer kind of encroaches the image, it's almost like the figures are in this kind of like deity or godlike form in terms of the skill. So one of the things that I also kind of work with is also translucency. And thinking about prints on different fabric material was also one way where I could actually get the photographic image to interact with the space, the site-specific elements like the wind as well as the light and the shadows kind of intersecting with the image, which you can actually see quite significantly right here, where light actually render parts of the body transparent or completely translucent, and also kind of causes the image to actually disappear into the site. So the site reclaims or eats up the image in some way. And as you can see, as you walk through the path, that's where you will end encountering the image of the sea itself, kind of gently nudging and prompting the viewers or the people walking down the passage to think about how the sea both joins us and also separates us. So this period, in a kind of vulnerable state, it really weighed me down by a lot of guilt and anxiety being away from my young daughter. Her father became her primary caregiver. But art, however, became a very crucial outlet for me to process these emotions. And through it, I channel a lot of my tension between my personal and professional roles, using creative expression as a way to cope with the distance, as well as the emotional weight of that time. So 2020, a very significant year for many of us. That's where I actually moved back to Singapore for good. And that January where we moved back, it was actually for my daughter's education. It was just 2 months. I remember we returned on the 1st of January 2020, and then just 2 months in, COVID hit, and the circuit breaker and the lockdowns all came in. And that was when, in a very strange and very surreal way, in the midst of the pandemic, I had to find ways to find home back in Singapore again. So I returned to Singapore in 2020. It was a necessary move for my daughter's education. It brought me back into a familiar space, but also with a new perspective. Actually, I was lost most of the time because I could not recognize most of Singapore being away for such a long time. I also couldn't get myself in tune with the apps that people were using. So I was a little bit like in a kind of very weird space, and then COVID hit, and then came the lockdowns, and it meant also a temporary separation, actually quite an extended separation of my child and myself from her dad, and we also had limited contact with extended family. And during this time, it was also the time where I discovered that my grandmother had dementia, which also then prompted that, hey, maybe Min, someday in future, you might get dementia as well. So it prompted me to find new ways to stay connected with myself as well as my family, even from a distance. But this period really kind of reinforced the importance of my ability to adapt, to be resilient, which was two qualities that I really had to find a lot as I moved from space to space. So being back in Singapore, this was the work that I created. It's called Spaces Between the Cloud. Usually I will name the title of my artworks in Malay or in Bahasa Indonesia. In Bahasa Indonesia is Ruang di Antara Awan. But coming back to Singapore, I also want to kind of be closer to my roots as a Southern Chinese artist. And I also gave the title 空间云间空间 to title the work. So I think the title of this work kind of reflects a lot of my identities that I was grappling with. So this work reflects the act of holding space for others, particularly in the context of caregiving for those with dementia, exploring themes of presence, support, navigating uncertainty. When we hit COVID, I realized that the one key importance to tide us through this very difficult time was the element of care and nurturing. So we hear a lot about the nurses in the hospitals, the frontliners, really going all out to show care. And caregiving was also something that was at the back of my mind, understanding how my parents were aging, and also understanding how my grandma had dementia. And this artwork was part of the National Arts Council commission as part of this project called Silver Arts. And I was actually working together with a group of seniors and their caregivers at a center called Dementia Singapore. And with them, I went back to my old technique of cyanotype, which I actually worked with in Malam di Jari Kita with the batik pieces. And that's where we actually excavated old images of the senior's life through photography once more. So instead of creating a new image, I started to look at found images through time. And what I noticed about seniors with dementia is that they cannot remember what they ate for lunch, but they can remember what happened during the World War II. Even more strongly and more significantly than what they had for lunch or who they saw yesterday. And I think that was a really significant part of having dementia, that memory and time goes in this warp, that you don't have a sense of the presence, but you're so strongly connected to the past. And this was something I really wanted to bring out in this artwork. At the same time, as you can see the organic shapes in the artwork, that shape was a significant shape to me, because the first time we realized that my grandma had dementia was when we saw the MIR brain scan. And the doctor was like, okay, look at these parts of the brain, the neurons are not firing, and that's where there's a space or like a gap where the brain activity has kind of slowed down or disappeared or is in absence of. And that was when we first saw the image of the MRI scan, I was like, oh, it looked like clouds. And that was at the same time where I also started a mindfulness practice. And a lot of times in my mindfulness practice, as I close my eyes, I regard my thoughts and my memories, worrying about the future, thinking about the past, as clouds in my consciousness. And as I kind of recognize and acknowledge them in part of my mind space, I also tell myself, the clouds are there, I'm here to let it go. And they will move past in a very slow and gentle way. And that's where the symbol or the image of clouds became a very significant part of the work. In this work, I was also exploring translucency, materiality, and also movement as well. And that's the reason why I'm showing a video right here. And as it moves, you will notice that the layers of fabric also renders part of the image slightly more mute, slightly more out of focus. And then in times where the fabric meets once more, it starts to sharpen again. And that really prompts me to get me to think about how we encounter our memories. There are times where it's so lucid, it's so sharp, but there's also times where we, struggle to actually grasp it, where it just disappears and fade away. And I really want the materiality of the work to mimic how we reckon with our memories in our minds. Okay. So this is the process of actually creating work with the seniors in the Dementia Center. And here we are, 2024 at present. Leaving to me is very much about releasing and revisiting. So last year in 2023, I was like, hey, I know so much about the Indonesian culture. I know so much about the Indonesian heritage, but I barely know anything about my own lineage. And that's why I grabbed my dad. I was like, Dad, we are going to go back to China. We're going to find our roots. And we took the whole family, 3 generations of us in December. It was the first ever non-work trip that I went, just to find our roots. And we found ourselves in Quanzhou in Xiamen. And guess what? We didn't find anything. But we found something, because that's when I realized that as with my surname as Zhao, we found a village called San Zhao, where 3 villagers or 3 groups of the Zhao family actually moved in to stay together with one another. And we actually found a temple, which you see in the top right-hand corner. And in that temple, we will see names of all the other families with the surname Zhao who actually left from Xiamen to come to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And my family is one of them, who then recontributed to building the temple. And what I realized that the reason why we did not find anything, everything was just gone, was because during the Song dynasty, we had 12 generations of emperors that Seng Zhao, that had the surname Zhao. And ever since then, with the end of that lineage of emperors, my family was nomadic. We were moving around China because we were avoiding civil war, because at that point in time, they really want to just kill the family line altogether. And during the Cultural Revolution, we were left with nothing, no jiapu, no family books, because everything was just burned. So the absence of my family history actually signifies a presence of this very, very violent history that my family actually went through. And a lot of times with my partner, he was like, oh, you barely know your roots. No, I was telling him, no, I'm going to find out. And I found out why we knew nothing because of this significant part of history. This is also the time where I actually somewhat left the art world a little bit to focus on creating a social enterprise with another fellow artist, Tan Ling, who's a sound artist. And we started a social enterprise together. So we're in the business space quite a bit for now. We do want to come back. And also this year is also the time where I actually start to grapple with my new identity as a single mother and also as a co-parent, where I will be raising 2 of my children together. 2 of my children in Singapore. Also, like a whole kind of historical cycle. This year was, is it this year or last year? Okay, this is also when the Orchard Station, which I was commissioned to create the public artwork for, started to operate. And this was the last work that I created right before I left Singapore to Indonesia. And that whole cycle coming back meant the realization of the work in operation as the actual MRT station itself. So this was commissioned in 2012, and it was developed together in collaboration with the curator Charmaine, who was formerly also from the National Gallery, now at Tate. Okay, so moving quickly. Okay, yeah. So I came back to my artistic practice just last June in a residency on Nicoy Island at the Ubah Rumah Residency. And that's where I started to encounter the Singapore, Malaysia, Riau region and the heritage. And that was where I also started a lot with coming back to site-specific large-scale works. And I also thought about myself as a parent. With my daughter now 11 years old, she's actually pretty well versed in photography right now. So we actually collaborated to create a photo story and a blog, which you can actually scan in a QR code right here, and you can read it and you encounter it. And in this artwork, in the new artwork that I developed, I worked together with the material of the galambu, or the mosquito net, which is quintessential to family life across Southeast Asia. And these moments of being in the galambu, it's a very special moment for me and my family, because that's where I will huddle up with my kids, actually reading bedtime stories, actually bonding with them right before sleep. So it's a symbol of comfort, safety, and family belonging for me. So this is one of the works that I'm currently working on. So kind of reflecting on the present and reflecting on the theme of the panel, thriving has never been about achieving success in one place or another. It's really about constantly evolving, constantly morphing, kind of reflecting what Zee has shared in her practice, wherever I am. And leaving is not so much about running away, it's about creating a space for new experience. Returning on the other side is a way about rediscovering the familiar through new lens. So what's interesting is that coming up in December, I will actually have a group exhibition back in Yogyakarta, together with A's House Collective at the in EC Yogyakarta. And what was interesting is, like, I was telling Lucas when he approached me for this panel, it's like, Lucas, the whole time I was in Indonesia, I did not get one invite to show there as an artist. But when I came back to Singapore, that's where the opportunities came. And then shortly after, Gintani from ACE was like, hey, Mintio, we want to show your spaces between the cloud, So I was like, I said too soon. So interestingly, it's only when I came back and complained to somebody, that's where it manifested somehow. And so in December, I will be showcasing spaces between the clouds with A's House at the EC Yogyakarta. So that's upcoming if you are traveling to Yogyakarta in December. But I won't be there, I'll be somewhere else. Come speak to me later to ask me where I'll be going. Okay.
Thanks, Min. Okay, that was really, really comprehensive. You preempted my question, so I think it's okay. We'll move on to Erika's presentation. Okay, on to Erika Tan. Born and educated in Singapore, Erika Tan moved to the UK to study anthropology, then filmmaking, and finally fine art. Her research-based practice evolved from an interest in received narratives, contested heritage, subjugated voices, and the transnational movement of ideas, people, and things. It responds to the unraveling of facts and fictions. Her work has been exhibited internationally, including at the Jakarta Biennale, at the Diaspora Pavilion in Venice, as well as institutions like National Gallery Singapore, Tate, Taipei Fine Arts Museum, the ZKM Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, and the 4A Center for Contemporary Asian Art in Sydney. She is also a reader in contemporary arts practice and Masters of Fine Art course leader in Central St. Martin's. In recent works, Erika has responded to works by artists like Kim Lim, and will be telling us about it today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to start my presentation with a series of acknowledgements. Yeah, the first is to acknowledge a lineage of migration histories, or my lineage of migration histories. This is a photograph of my paternal grandfather, Tam King Bok, taken in the early 1920s. He was a migrant from Anhui in Fujian province, and his story is similar to many of that period. Basically, he left a small rural village in China to seek a better life elsewhere. Leaving to thrive, it could be argued, is part of Singapore's DNA, or maybe just one part of Singapore's DNA. Whether this be a pull or a push, a sojourning gesture or colonial maneuver. These grand narratives of 20th century migration do, however, often obliterate smaller, nuanced, gendered migration stories and stories that go somewhat against the grain or the flow of people. Slide. The other image I want to share is that of my mother, seen here with my father. She left the UK in her early 20s after having met my father in London, who was sent there by his older brother to do his A-levels. Oh, it seems like it's getting an echo on this. By his older brother to do his A-levels in his late 20s. And this was due to the disruptions brought about by the Japanese occupation in Singapore. So after completing his studies, he was ordered home to join the family business. So he spent sort of 2 or 3 years in London. Tam Kin Bok's move, that's my grandfather, had seemingly resulted in a thriving existence for his descendants in Singapore. For my mother, she left the UK on her own, without any promises for my father, and with the damnation of her own family. She would often say she felt that England was stifling and that it felt like everything had already been done. I could argue that my existence comes from the decisions to leave and commitments to stay that both these two people made at very different times and for very different reasons. My grandfather's movements echoes that of thousands of other Fujian men at the time. My mother's movements were certainly far less common, although women moving for the men they love is a much more familiar trope. So, next slide, please. The next acknowledgement, you can play it as well, with the sound down. That's okay. The next acknowledgement is to thank National Gallery Singapore, Lucas Huang and his team, for the invitation to speak on this panel, Leave to Thrive, and which has also very importantly given me an opportunity to actually come home. Since leaving Singapore at the age of 17, similar age to Kim Lim, I have returned and left many times. Sometimes I returned thinking I would be staying on forever, and at other times I came specifically to be with my family or to look after them temporarily. In the last couple of decades, it has increasingly been my work as an artist that has facilitated my return journeys and the circling back to Singapore that has taken place in my work. From work in Singapore's first Biennale in 2006, which was held in this actual building, and consisted of a look-alike ventriloquist dummy of myself, playing the role of an itinerant international artist pledging allegiance to a multiplicity of flags and nations, to my series on the forgotten Malay weaver, Halima binti Abdullah, who left the region for London in 1924 to participate in the British Empire exhibition, but unfortunately died and never returned home. Part of this work was commissioned by National Gallery Singapore in 2015 for its inaugural launch. It gave me an opportunity to make work specifically for an audience in Singapore and to address a rapidly developing post-colonial Singaporean art history. The work Apajika, the misplaced comma, Apajika meaning what if, was ostensibly about Halima the Weaver, but the key questions in the work were about returns, and if or how we might imagine repatriating Halima and understanding her significance within the Singapore art history that for most part, that was up until 2017 at least, had little or no representation or visibility given to the Malay female artist. Wrapped into this work was also my own connection to stories of leaving and returning and existing in somewhat dislocated and indeterminate places. The figure of Halima was in some ways my ticket home. Excuse my really dry mouth. I flew in last night, so I've got jet lag and dehydration, I think. Anyway, so these metaphorical and real journeys home are important, whether they be from official invitations to return or from work that seeks to form a connection between here and there. Each time I arrive at Changi, I have this deep sense of familiarity, even though there is no longer a family home and no members of my family come to pick me up at the airport. That's okay though, because I like the banter in the taxi with the taxi driver, which is where I usually get all the updates on governmental policies, the standard of living, and the price of food. It's also usually where I have my encounter with the questions of if and how I am Singaporean or still a Singaporean. This encounter usually ends with a waving of my little red passport. Both food and paperwork seem also at the heart of thinking about leaving to thrive. And we could also take a pause at this moment to think about those that don't have the paperwork and don't have the food that lead to thriving or not thriving. The third acknowledgement is that this talk is part of a series of events which connects the exhibition to Kim Lim, the space in between, a retrospective. This exhibition has been a long time coming and feels very much like a celebratory return. Finally, she or her works have come home and the importance of her work to a Singaporean context have been acknowledged. Singaporean art history has become that one step closer to an international art history, and Kim Lim's status within the national canon has become that much more secure. I think we can now say she is home. At this point, I'm reminded by the writing of Caribbean writer Sylvia Wynter, who was writing in the mid-60s about the plight of the West Indian writer. In the text, we must learn to sit down together and discuss a little cultural reflection on West Indian writing and criticism. She outlines the plight of the West Indian writer, who she says, in wanting a market and an audience, must go to England or the metropolitan centre. This move is a form of exile, cutting them off from an audience and a lived experience back home and submerged in a myth of a Europe or the metropolitan centre that actually rejects all other experiences. So, next slide, please. Not yet. So I'd like to spend the rest of the presentation looking at some of the narratives around leaving, arriving, staying, and making one's way in the world in relation to artists, predominantly women artists, and to share a particular relationship I have with Kim Lim, who I regard in some ways as part of a constellation of individuals and ancestors who provide some navigational tools for me. In the video I'll show you next, this is a work titled Ancestral Revocations. It was shown in London 2 weeks ago at the Tanks at Tate Modern. It's a series of automated instruments made from fragments of Southeast Asian instruments collected since childhood that are sonifying the collections data from 2 major institutions in the UK. These are the Tate, with collections of modern and contemporary art, and the Wellcome Institute, whose collections are predominantly material culture and research reflecting global health and medical developments. The video in the background is shot within both institutions and incorporates visitations to the work of David Madala, Vong Phao Phanet, and Kim Lim, artists who are collected by the Tate and who are or were based in London, but were also from elsewhere, and more specifically for me, had connections to Southeast Asia. So yes, please. Oh, and you can turn the sound up quite loud. Can you put the sound up? You might have to look quite carefully to where the sound is coming from. Okay, so because we're short on time, we can move on to the next slide. So what I didn't manage to capture in the video clip is the visitation to Kim Lim's work. So here in the background, you can see Sphinx, which is on permanent display in Tate, unless you've taken it for the show. No, it's still there then. Okay. All right, so there are 2 reasons to share this work here. Firstly, it's the ongoing engagement of my work with questions of national collections and the kinds of art histories that can be written or imagined through the collections that exist, and the need that these collections are not bound by the same kind of border patrolling that actual nations are. This work takes place both within Singapore and within Britain, and across these 2 locations for me. And the second reason is to raise the question of what thriving as an artist might mean. In what ways do we thrive? Under what conditions? Under whose frameworks are we seen, supported, acknowledged, and in what time or place? In the here and now, or perhaps the afterlife? Whilst showing work in the Tate can be considered a bit of a coup, and this word comes up later in relationship to Kim's own work, does it matter that this work was included in the Tate through its educational program and not its curatorial program? And that the work was supported by grants which prioritize research around machine learning and transforming national collections. And that this focus comes off, the research focus comes off the back of and is an extension of discussions in the UK around diversity and the Black arts movement. It's easy to fall into the trap of devaluing work and seeing work that engages with social concerns as being instrumentalized. After all, there is a long history to these pressures. One that if we look at some of the press that Kim Lim received, we can see that she was actually no stranger to. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So just these are kind of, I've got 3 slides, and this first one are from sort of tabloids. So carving a niche, light, rhythm, and water are key elements in the work of London-based Singaporean sculptor Kim Lim. And the second, an honorable exception. Tiny, pretty, relaxed, she is exactly what one expects of a sophisticated Oriental woman. Next slide, please. Kim Lim, no young mod, but sculptress with an Asian slant. And then breaking the rules, Singapore-born sculptress Kim Lim has pulled off another coup in her career. The Tate Gallery in London bought a piece of her work from her solo exhibition last year. And the final one is less of a tabloid, more of an art press. So alongside works by Frank Aubach, Kenneth Martin, and John Latham, Kim Lim's work, Intervals 1 and 2, and Interstices 2, have been chosen in the words of the exhibition's press release because they were both personally stimulating and worth bringing to the public's attention. And then it goes on to say, Kim was the only woman artist to be exhibited and the only non-white artist in the entire show. So somehow she can't escape these forms of categorization and framing. In terms of my relationship to Kim, I have never actually met Kim, but I became aware of her quite early on in my developing practice. When the exhibition The Other Story took place in 1989 in London, I looked for her work, expecting in some ways that she might be included. The Other Story was curated by the artist Rashid Arian and is often described as a milestone exhibition that focused on the works of Asian, African, and Caribbean artists in post-war Britain. And the exhibition produced a curatorial response to Arian's words to the racism, inequality, and ignorance in Britain of other cultures. Kim's absence was not because she hadn't been asked to participate, but because she had said no to being portrayed as other. Another example of this attempt at self-determination was when she was invited to be part of a group exhibition called Half the Sky, Chinese Women in London. I was working on this project as a curatorial researcher and was interested in her initial response. What is more curious, and I don't have the answer to, is that she changed her mind and was eventually included in the exhibition. But on both occasions, she demonstrated a vocality to how she wanted to be framed and indicated what she might have had to be dealing with. The last point of reference I want to raise is that posthumously, Kim's work has undergone further research and framing. Whilst her work has become much more overtly collected, the framing is very interesting. Within the context of the UK and as a response to Black Lives Matter's movement, a research project called Black Artists and Modernism found that within this context, Kim was the most collected Black female artist within public collections in Britain. It's difficult to imagine that this statistic and framing would have been welcomed by her. I'm going to end the talk with a series of video clips from a work called Spectral Entanglements. It's a meeting in filmic space of 4 women artists who in real life may never have met, but share in their own ways and from their particular situated experiences, forms of movement, travel, dislocation, arrivals, and departures. We see different contexts, generational differences, and disparate positionalities, but we also see repeated patterns of concern for survival, for growth, for understanding, acceptance, and for acknowledgement professionally. The work is scripted from interviews, press releases, diaries, and archival documents, and is reenacted through the embodied experiences of contemporary individuals based in London. The artists being portrayed or performed are Kim Lim, Georgette Chen, Dora Gordine, and Fei Tan, who was my mother. One of the connections between these 4 women is Singapore. So I'm just going to play the clips and we can see how far we can go before you stop me. Oh, you've jumped one.
Camera rolling. Say Kim, take 1. In?
Upside.
Yeah. Okay, action.
I am Kim. I don't make art. I make sculpture and prints.
Action.
I am Fei, Fairy Fei. Cunliffe, Tan, Fei Tan, Say Tan, Satan.
I am Dora. I'm Dora. I am Dora.
I am Chandana. Georgette. Zhang Liying. Mrs. Chen. Artist. Painter. Even though Paris itself is a paradise, there's so many beautiful subjects to paint in Paris. It was the whole atmosphere, the cost of living, the international climate.
Dora, we were there at the same time in Paris. It's a wonder you two didn't meet.
I don't recall us ever meeting, but I would have loved to have had you sit for me at the time. In fact, one of my most well-remembered works, and indeed the one that launched my career, was my Chinese head.
You know how it is. A European one day sees a Chinese like you, and before you know it, he will run after you to paint you.
I met my husband in a park. He was photographing models and
I
flowers.
met my husband.
We
at
went
art
for tea.
college. He
Went
is
on from
also
there.
a sculptor.
I'd learnt Mandarin, and he was Chinese. I followed him to Singapore. My parents disowned me, but I felt in need of searching, following
I've
him,
had 2 husbands.
entering a whole new world.
No children. Although I often think of my work as my children.
My first husband took me to British Malaya, where I was commissioned to paint portraits of the local people.
People often say my
I
work
traveled
was
through
overlooked,
Java,
overshadowed
China,
by my husband.
India.
A lot is made of the fact that I'm Chinese, a woman. As a young artist, I am successful in Paris. My work is collected there. Later on, I'm celebrated in Singapore as a pioneer Nanyang painter.
My son.
Teach there for many years.
We built a
survive.
house together and filled it with things from my travels.
Singapore opened me up. We lived in his family, his extended family. There were children and wives everywhere. I had to make my own way. I learned to make clothes. I learned to teach the children art. I made ceramics. I learned to build kilns. So how did you feel about leaving home?
Well, I loved it. It felt like the cage had opened. My parents, they were always really upset with me because I never felt homesick. But I knew there had to be more.
For me, there was no choice. It was leave or be caged. First the Bolsheviks, then the others. I too felt trapped and moved to the east.
I didn't know what it meant to be an artist. It seemed like something historical, more than a living reality. My parents sent me to art school, like a finishing school. They always thought I would return. But it's not a place for art. It's so small, so hermetically sealed. Creative endeavors would never develop.
I suppose that's how one would feel anywhere, that you stayed too long. Or maybe it's teenage rebellion. I know that when I left home, I sailed away on a ship on my own. I was going towards adventure and excitement.
I suppose for me things were a bit different. I'm the product of 4 world events, 4 wars, 2 Chinese revolutions, the one of Dr. Sun and then later of Mao, and of course the First and Second World Wars, in all of which I was inexorably involved and which led to multiple leavings and arrivals. By then I'd become a displaced person, and I was in search of a quiet place somewhere in Asia.
Okay, so I'll end there. There is another clip, but I'll try not to play it. Apologies for the lack of sync. There's something not quite right, I think, there. But the last clip that I didn't play was actually a much more morbid note, because it's a nice point to sort of stop maybe with the idea that Singapore is a kind of Tahiti. Because the next clip is of Georgette talking about how, in actual fact, she spent her last 10 years bedbound. And within all of the artists that I was working with, there is a moment in their lives where, to be honest, I don't think you can call thriving something that they did, even though at other points maybe the career may have looked quite different. Yeah, so I'll end there.
Erika? So I know we're over time, and we agreed, Erika, we'll have all the panelists come back up. So maybe we'll go on a little bit until 3:45, if that's okay. Thanks for staying with us. Yeah, and I will just go right into it and ask if there are any questions from the audience. It can be for all the panelists or just one of them. Yes, microphones, please. What do you think this? Yep.
Hello, hi. Yeah, I'm Bob. I'm like a uni student currently. So my question is more directed for Erika. Because you mentioned that like Kim is quite particular about how she's framed a certain way in regards to like being this like Singapore diaspora in England. Do you feel like you also have a similar stance, or is it like different for you in some way? Thank you.
No, I think it's, you know, same but different. I think complicated maybe my own personal heritage, the kind of engagement with framing and race and nation is something I experienced before I left Singapore, as well as in England. As a mixed race person, I think there are different but similar ways of being cast as outside of the national framework. So my relationship remote to Singapore is also one of a tentative ambivalence, a desire to be accepted while recognizing maybe that will never happen, and maybe just in the UK context, I am there, I have a child there. It's an ongoing kind of thing. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment and an observation between your work and your work here, where you focus on the hands, and Zee's work on extremities that she loves. The only the distinction I would say is yours is more measured. Hers, I assume when she does it, will be just all out.
Thank you. Lily, do you have a question? I'm not, no obligations. Okay.
Okay, so just I noticed that one too. So do talk about the hands. So at the end of it all, you've lived here, lived there, lived everywhere. So in your mind now, are you tired of trying to define home and identity and all that, so that you are just willing to kind of have your own definition, whatever that definition is? And so what is home to you now? So, you know, when you come into Singapore, the narrative of home is like so prescribed. And so without going to a National Day parade, song. I just want to ask you, so where are you now in all these years of being nomadic and moving around, that you are that you are either not willing to talk about the concept of home, or you're willing to say my home is where my child is, or I mean, how do you deal with it? Okay, hands first.
Hands first. I will testing. I would like to respond to that question. Thank you for that question. It's an ongoing question at the back of my head always. Where I am at the moment is that I fully accepted and anchored myself in my identity as a nomad. That's where I am. That's just the reality. I do travel a lot for work everywhere, and I enjoy what I do. And that is who I am right now. And I think a sense of home, it's more of a feeling, isn't it? I think for me, I used to think, oh, it's definitely a place, it's a geographical place where I can locate myself. Like, okay, Singapore's home, but Singapore is really where I grew up. Singapore is where I was born. Singapore raised me. But every time I come home, it might not necessarily feel like home. You know, like I have this multiple morphing homes that's going around that makes sense for me. It doesn't have to be, it's very transient. I don't necessarily have to be in one place to feel like that. And I think that comes back to my chat earlier on about within my practice itself, how I find that anchor within the morphing and the currents that happen around, which is why I landed on morphology. And I feel that question kind of relates back to I think in my younger years, I was really looking a lot on my ancestral lineage and my ancestral studies, knowing where I come from, knowing how can I locate these names and stuff. And I realized it's so hard to do this because within where, my family lineage, archival wasn't a thing. I don't have a surname. Like, it's not something that we can locate quite easily. Who is past 4 generations, and then I had to make sense for it for myself. And I feel like we need to normalize being a nomad. We look at the history of humanity, we are constantly nomads. I am just doing the thing that we've always been doing. And I think we're still in that space where it feels strange for people when they ask me where I am based and I say I am a nomad, right? Like they're like, oh, but where is it that you have your favorite room? Or I say, I don't have that. I really don't. My partner lives in Switzerland. My parents are here at the back and they live here in Singapore. I have, I visit them here every now and then. I have my in-laws in Australia and I travel wherever work is. When I was working with Hofarchitecture Company, we were constantly bopping around from places to places. And you just need to find that anchor in that sense. It's more of a sensation and a feeling for me. Maybe one day a person might locate me. If I have a child, maybe that could be home. But as of now, I think I'm just really doing what it feels like my ancestral lineage have always been doing anyways. Everyone moved here for a new life, for a better life, or to thrive somewhere else, right? And I guess I'm just doing that in the process of me being an artist. Yeah.
What about hands?
What about hands?
For you or for Erika?
Oh, yes. So I'm going to talk about the response to the hands. Yeah, I guess that comes back to my folk dance training in traditional Malay dance. Like, this is why I have this obsession with hands and how I articulate it and the different things that it can do. And oh man, I can dig a very deep hole here when I talk about hands, but I think it really roots down and comes back from the Malay dance background, and I bring that into my contemporary practice. But it's so cool that you have that in your video as well. That's awesome. Just different ways.
It's probably, I have worked with dancers in the past. Don't dance. I wanted to find a way that the individuals could physically connect and the extremities. I mean, I love the way you talk about extremities. The extremities were in some way how they might touch. That was it. But just in terms of home, I think for me, it's much. I'm interested in the question of the institutional home and the lack of an institutional home. And I think when you mentioned that in a way, you know, going back to China and looking, you know, in the temple, you didn't have your family names. In the temple in Anhui province, you know, I do have my family name. But not everyone does. And the kind of colonial records and the post-colonial records seem to also be multiplying and, you know, duplicating or repeating the same kind of absences of the past. So a lot of my work is around the absences within institutional homes and the way in which people are excluded from those sites.
Home is Singapore for me. I think mainly the COVID experience actually kind of grounded my roots here, and also it stopped all the traveling and the moving around. It's also kind of grounded with my two children. Now I have two kids, and like finding that system and structure for them is very important. But while kind of being grounded, I realized then that's where I have the full clarity and space to really grapple with all the identities that I've accumulated over the past years, and also having to let go of some of them. And so then home creates that safe space for me to be able to deal with that right now.
Thank you. I really think that's all the time we have today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Please join me in thanking our three panelists, Zee Zunnur, Mintio, and Erika Tan.